So I think we've given the go-ahead from tech that everything is up and streaming where it needs to be streaming. So I'm Lisa Engel, and I nominated Dr. Robin Mazumder for the Illuminate Speakership in conjunction with the Keynote. So I think we've given for the Masters of Occupational Therapy Critical Inquiry Research Symposium that is being held throughout the day today. And Dr. Mazumder's lecture is called Pushing Boundaries and Creating Space in Healthcare and Social Policy. But before we go forward with that lecture, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba, and where I'm sitting in my home, are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the OG Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And so I do respect the treaties that were made in these territories and acknowledges the harms and atrocities of the past. As we are becoming more and more aware of the atrocities, which is kind of on the mind of our country right now, but have been known for a long time. We dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities, and I think as part of that, being allies and accomplices in aiming Canada towards having more autonomy for Indigenous folks over their own lands. And so this is Dr. Robin Mazumder is our speaker today, and I'll introduce him just now. So he's an award-winning urban neuroscientist with a keen interest in understanding how living in cities impacts well-being. And his PhD research, which was funded by a Vanier Canada graduate scholarship, used wearable technology in real and immersive settings or reality settings to examine psychological and physiological responses to the urban built environment. And his research interests are informed by his clinical experience working as a mental health occupational therapist in the urban cores of Canadian cities, including Toronto and Edmonton. So Dr. Mazumder's hands-on clinical experience, in conjunction with his training in urban neuroscience, uniquely positions him to collaborate with scientists, practitioners, policymakers, and the public to create healthy urban environments. And he's also an outspoken advocate for the urban design that supports well-being and has given more than 30 keynote lectures internationally on the topic. He is passionate about science communication and has been interviewed by and written for major media publications, including BBC, CBC, HuffPost, and Wired magazine. So I just want to give a little bit of a story of how I learned of Dr. Mazumder's work. So sometime during my PhD, while I was living on the 19th floor in 600 square feet with a cat, a partner, and a baby, I became aware of Dr. Mazumder's work and his focus on the environment and mental health. And I was just starting out on Twitter, so I quickly followed him, and his posts have, over the years, have both enlightened me to new areas of research, but as my own research in a very different area of finance kept progressing, his continual push for looking at the environment when we're looking at important concepts about health, well-being, functioning, participation, and performance really resonated with me. His ideas have kept the environment at the forefront. And he's also become one of the most prolific science communicators with an occupational therapy background. And as the one photo shows here, that he's been on the cover of magazines and publishing in many widely read mediums. And he's really getting OT and rehabilitation noticed. And the more I prepared for asking Robin to be a speaker, the more I found published about and by him. So there's many times cooking that I was listening to different YouTube videos of interviews you've done, Robin. But also one interesting one that if we can press the next, just press enter, who's controlling the screen. Robin also was a co-organizer of Edmonton's largest snowball fight. So I don't know if he's going to touch on that of his speakership today, but maybe that's a presentation for another day. I found it to be very intriguing and very Winnipeg focused. I'm sure there's a few people that'd love to know how you did it and the outcomes for when this pandemic is over. So Dr. Mazumder, I look forward to hearing from you and your presentation, Pushing Boundaries and Creating Space in Healthcare and Social Policy. Thank you, Robin.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Just checking, you can hear me okay? Okay, great. Let me just get my computer here. So I talked to Lisa last week, and we decided that I would do something different, and that I would improvise today. But before I get into it, I'll make a landed acknowledgement from where I am. I'm in Mexico City right now, in Coyoacan. And Mexico City in Mexico is named after the Mexica people, indigenous people who lived in this area, along with the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples. And so while I'm not in Canada, I really was quite upset by hearing about what happened with the residential schools in BC. And I also want to acknowledge the lives lost in Kamloops, but also everyone in the history of Canada with the legacy of genocide. And so it's a very, very somber couple of weeks here, but I'm going to try and bring some hope. So I'll start. So what I'm doing is I wrote an outline here, and I'm going to bounce around and tell a story about my life. And in the process, try to have a conversation about how we change disciplines, systems, healthcare systems, cities. And by the end, hopefully you can have a conversation. So I'm going to try and keep it to about 40 minutes. Lisa, how long do you have? Because you said you have a bit of extra time.
40 minutes is fine. Technically the Illuminate speakership ends at 1, but we do have a 15-minute break after this for the symposium. So if it goes over a bit over 1, it should be okay.
Okay, great. I'm just going to keep the time here. So it's 12:11. Okay, so I'm going to start by just talking about where I'm from. I grew up in Victoria, BC. My parents, sit in shop, and I think might be watching. And they're both scientists. My dad's an aquatic ecologist and a biologist and a fisheries scientist, and actually does quite a lot of work with indigenous peoples up north looking at water quality. So I grew up in, Lisa, I don't know what happened here. Is my camera still on?
Yes, it is.
Okay, because I can only see yours. Sorry. So I grew up in a lab, and in that lab, my mom worked there as well. She's a chemist. So I grew up looking at ecosystems, and actually my first job was collecting water quality samples out in the Souk Reservoir in Victoria. Really lucky my dad gave me that opportunity. And that's really where I started to think about the world as an ecosystem. And that lens, I think, has really permeated everything I've done ever since. I went to the University of Victoria. I did my undergrad in biology, and I did that with the intention to do my medical degree. Everyone I knew in my biology program took all the prereqs, and that was kind of the plan. But at the same time, I started a co-op placement as part of my biology undergrad. And that placement was really what got me started on this track in rehab, because I worked for an organization. I started volunteering with them and then it turned to a job called Recreation Integration Victoria. And their role was really to facilitate the inclusion of youth with disabilities within summer camps. It was a very fascinating experience for me to have that experience working with these kids while doing classes in molecular biology. And so over the course of my undergrad, I really focused most of my time when I wasn't in school doing after school programs. And that's when I really started learning about occupational therapy in a very kind of removed way. I knew the kids I worked with had OTs, but I didn't know too much about it. So when I finished my undergrad, I ended up randomly winning a $10,000 Canadian International Development Agency fund with one of my best friends, Sean, who did his degree in Russian and Slavonic studies at UVic. And he came to me and asked me if I wanted to apply for this grant to go work with kids in Russia. At that point, we really hadn't had much of a plan. We just made something up because he had a friend who lived in Khanty-Mansisk, which is in northern Siberia, who knew about an orphanage there. And she said that there were children with disabilities who lived at this orphanage. So we thought we would go over and try to do an inclusion program for these kids in Siberia. And we ended up getting the money. So I spent the summer right after my undergrad living in northern Siberia, working with kids with disabilities and learning a lot about the challenges that people face in other kind of cultural contexts. Russia at that time, and I'm not sure what it's like today, but it wasn't a particularly friendly place for kids with disabilities. And so a lot of these families lived at this orphanage in isolation, quite alone. And so over the course of that summer, Sean and I just, first we had to find the families because they weren't, no one really wanted to talk about it. No one in government wanted to talk about it. The orphanage that we had planned to work with, the kids ended up actually not being there. They were in Sochi. So we had to kind of start from scratch and find this community of parents of children with disabilities. And at the end of the summer, we ended up actually, I think it was a successful program. The parents said they felt safer in the community. And since our departure, they started a community where they connected with other parents. And when I came back, I got a job as a research analyst at CanAssist, which is an assistive technology nonprofit organization at the University of Victoria. And my job there was as a research analyst to look at best practices in supported workplace programs for youth. But while I was there, the executive director, his name is Nigel Livingston, said that, hey, you seem like someone who really enjoys working with people. And I think you'd be a great occupational therapist. And now I think it was in September of 2010, and I had no idea what occupational therapy was, and I rapidly applied to the program. So I think the deadline was in like November or December, Googling what OT was as I was writing my essays, and miraculously got into the University of Toronto, which I wasn't expecting because my marks is from my first year in undergrad, when I had to take biochem and biology and all these classes involving rote memorization, weren't the best. So I was actually quite surprised that I got into U of T. And then that changed my life. So occupational therapy and the OT education really made me start to think, about, occupation as a means to well-being, but also, as Lisa had mentioned earlier, about the influence of the environment. And the classes we took exposed us to, the COPM, the CMOP, but particularly the PEO, which was taught to me by the late Dr. Patty Rigby, really just rocked my world, because I started to see this ecosystem, which is something that was, part of my childhood. And I saw this interplay between the environment and people and what they did. And I was also particularly interested in mental health. So the majority of my placements really focused on mental health. I worked at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and Forensics in inpatient inpatient schizophrenia. And I also worked at a boarding home named St. George House. And that was my last placement. And it was an independent placement. And in that role, it was really like the launching point, because it was an independent placement. I did a lot of one-on-one work with clients who were actually quite compromised in and out of, CAMH. And that's when I started wondering about this transition between the institution and the home, which was within the context of the city in Toronto, and considering these environmental variables. When someone's in the hospital and they're acutely psychotic and you spend about a month helping them stabilize, how do you get them from that institutional setting back to the community? And what parts of the community are supportive of their well-being from that environmental perspective, and what parts were inhibiting that? And soon after my getting my OT degree in 2011, I got my first job at the inpatient unit at CAMH in their schizophrenia unit. And that was really baptism by fire. My placements had prepared me quite a bit, but I learned a lot. And that interest in the environmental context grew and grew. I moved to Edmonton. I worked in a pediatric mental health clinic for kids with ADHD. Again, thinking about that environmental lens using the PEO, it really framed the work that I did. I was a mental health therapist. I wasn't officially an occupational therapist, but I used my OT lens. And then I started a job, which was really the big, I think, turning point in what brought me to my research. And that was working for a team called the COAS team. So the Community Outreach Assessment and Support Team. And it was a sector collaboration between the Ministry of the Ministry of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, the Ministry of Justice. We work with people with addictions issues, but most of our clients had a developmental disability, a mental illness, some justice system involvement, and were expressing challenging behaviors. And so challenging behaviors was basically the term for when people weren't able to communicate their needs and got frustrated and then would assault their caregivers, either their family or paid caregivers. And so I worked with both forms of caregivers to help them understand what was happening for the clients I was serving, and really trying to give them some opportunities to experience joy, because fundamentally, most of the people that I worked with lived quite isolated. They lived on the fringes of the city in boarding homes where a lot of these private companies operated them. And regardless of the, diagnoses that they had, what I saw as kind of the most detrimental and pervasive issue was that they were terribly lonely. And I would go in there, on our team, we had psychiatrists, nurses, 3 OTs, OTAs, behavioral analysts, and really the client that really moved me to start to examine these questions in more depth. He was recommended. I was recommended to see him by the psychiatrist on our team because he had attempted suicide, and so I went to meet with him and tried to gently ask what it was that made him consider that, and he just said, "I'm lonely. I don't have any friends, and there's no point. All I do is watch TV all day, and I never leave my house." Well, I was like, well, let's leave your house and go for a walk and see if we can find places for you to connect with people. And that's when it became very, very apparent to me that this issue that I saw as an issue of healthcare, or the healthcare system, was really one that was a product of a disabling environment. And I use the word disabling environment because the social model of disability was something that we learned at U of T. I think it's probably evolved into something else since then, but that really showed me the distinction between locating illness and disability within the person, and really understanding how the environment contributes to that disability. And when I used that lens to work with this person who came close to taking their own life, I saw that there was only so much I could do on a personal level from the perspective of intervention for the person, and wanted to explore ways to do that from a community and an urban design perspective. And while I was working in Edmonton as an OT, I was quite involved in the community. As Lisa mentioned, it landed me on a magazine, which was an interesting experience for that 1 month. I felt like a mini celebrity. I was just like, I'm just an OT. Not just an OT, OTs are great, but it was an interesting time. And one of the things that landed, I think, me with that opportunity, my friend Jason nominated me, but at the time I was doing lots of urban design or pop-up projects, like pop-up bike lanes, advocacy, activism. I launched that snowball fight that Lisa mentioned, which was really a random thing where me and a stranger at the time were tweeting back and forth about how we wanted to have a snowball fight because it was October and it had started snowing in Edmonton, and I was trying to find something to look forward to because at that point I didn't really like snow that much. We ended up having a snowball fight for 3,000 people. Anyways, all these things were happening, which then led me to be invited to be on the City of Edmonton Mayor Don Iveson's and Poverty Task Force, and I co-chaired the Community Wellbeing Working Group. I was a co-chair of that with Dr. Maria Mayan, who's a community engaged researcher at the U of A. And that's when I started to see I was having these clients that were terribly lonely and lived in parts of Edmonton where there was a lot of poverty. And I tried to advocate for some inquiry into how the design of the city and what the jurisdiction and the power that the city had as a municipality, what they could do to address something that I was struggling with as someone who was part of the healthcare system. And so that led me to all sorts of really interesting collaborations and connections with people who worked in the tech space. And I ended up leaving occupational therapy to run a startup accelerator for a year at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. Totally random. You would think, why would someone without a business background and a healthcare professional run a startup accelerator? But I was just really interested in ideation and iteration. And since then, I've been involved with some startups. And there was one course that I had to take as part of my training for this position, and that was with the Stanford Design School, the D School. And the D School is really one of the originators of design thinking, and they work closely with IDEO, who created, the Apple iPhone. And this design thinking process basically is a cycle that involves empathizing with the client or with the user of the product, using that empathy really to inform what the needs are. A lot of people create products or start companies or make things thinking the world needs it without really asking that question. And then they try to force people to use it, and then the startup kind of fails. So that empathy step really connected with me when I was thinking about this intersection between urban design and well-being, because I considered the clients I was working with and whether they had really been empathized with in the design of the community that they lived in. And so I then, around that time, had read an article. I was on Twitter and saw an article about how boring cities are bad for your mental health. And I thought it was a brilliant article. And I looked up who wrote it. And I saw that it was Dr. Colin Ellard, who was a neuroscientist at the University of Waterloo. I never took a class in neuroscience. I think I took one class in psych, but I sent him an email and said, hey, I'm an occupational therapist. I have a master's in occupational therapy. I'm really interested in looking at this question of how cities can support or inhibit mental health. What do you think? Can I do a PhD with you? And he said, yes. Can you start in 2 months? So, that's kind of how I roll. When a really good opportunity comes up, I jump on it. And that's what led me to the University of Waterloo, where I did my PhD using wearable technology, things that measure your heart rate, your blood pressure, your galvanic skin response. The galvanic skin response is also known as the electrodermal activity, which is essentially your rate of emotional sweat. And that was the main variable I used to measure people's emotional responses to different urban environments. And so over the course of my PhD, I ran experiments in collaboration with the City of Vancouver, in the Happy City Consultancy, and an urban planning, urban design firm called Modus. And we looked at how, paint in cities, like a rainbow crosswalk. We did a study in Davie Village, which is the queer neighborhood in Vancouver, and we looked at things like rainbow crosswalks and what that would do to your sense of happiness and your desire to connect with people. We looked at what green spaces did. We looked at what community gardens did, and I did that research on the side. But the focus of my dissertation was looking at the experience that people had when they were surrounded by tall buildings. Skyscrapers are a defining attribute of urban centers. They're being built at an unprecedented rate. They're seen as a solution to urban densification. But a lot of sociological critiques, Parker particularly, who I think is at Sheffield in the UK, talks about skyscrapers being capital made durable in places where very, very wealthy people store their money, to the detriment of the people around these places, because these buildings typically aren't too porous on the ground level, so their facades are mostly banks and you can't really engage with it. And so all of these aspects of these buildings, which are kind of seen as the saviors of the modern city, create an aesthetic and an experience that can be uncomfortable for people. And so my PhD really focused at looking at that. We did it in the real world. I did one of my biggest studies when I was one of 2 fellowships to study at University College London in London, UK. And I took people out into the city and measured their responses, their psychological and physiological responses. But that type of field research is quite difficult. There's all sorts of organizational issues. And the other aspect to consider when it comes to psychological research is ecological validity. So, we tried building these 3D models of cities and to place people in VR to have more control over, ensuring the signal of these physiological responses was a lot cleaner, because when you're in the city, you're wearing something like a watch, and it's not that great of a connection. So what we did was to maintain ecological validity of these environments, of these ecosystems that I was studying. We actually used a 360-degree video camera and then placed that in VR. So we took people in the real world in London, and then we took a video of that and took that video back to Waterloo, placed it in VR, and I was able to run many more participants and increase my statistical power. And I'm not going to bore you with the stats, but over the course of the studies, I found that people did find these settings very uncomfortable. And then I started to synthesize and look at research from sociology, as I mentioned, anthropology, computer science, evolutionary biology, comparative neuroscience, and all of these are just kind of buzzwords for the most part. But I think the integration of those different perspectives really allowed me to understand the evolutionary psychology involved in the environmental psychology of cities. And what was interesting about it was that mammals share a threat response system. And so when you look at animal studies, there's this response that animals have to looming objects that they just get quite stressed out, because it triggers this feeling of some sort of predator. And some people think that humans and babies particularly can demonstrate these similar kind of responses. So there's an unconscious response to the built environment of our city. That's the thesis of my thesis. And since then, I've developed a theory called experiential equity, which really builds on this question of how does living in a city affect your well-being? And the reason that I moved into experiential equity, I was just finishing my PhD. It was the pandemic. It is the pandemic, but it was like the pandemic had just started. I hope it will end soon. I really, really do. I know we all do. But I was asked to contribute to a textbook on urban design responses to the pandemic, to talk about, my perspective on urban issues. But this textbook is really focused, and it's coming out, it's being published by Policy Press. I think it's coming out in a month or two. This textbook is really focused on using a lens of equity and social justice. And at this intersection of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, I saw an intersection between space, place, and race, and how design itself will not solve the problems of our society. Building bike lanes aren't going to erase racism. Good parks might be considered to be, spaces of well-being, but for particular people. And I say this as a dark-skinned person of color. I've been in parks before where I've had to deal with racists and all sorts of, other forms of harassment. And I have privilege. I'm a man. So I started to think a cisgendered man. And so I started thinking about how these kind of complexities of your identity and how you're perceived by other people, and then the response that you get from these other people really add a layer on top of the way that, the urban landscape is experienced. Around a few months before, right at the beginning of the pandemic, there was Christian Cooper, who had the police called on him because he was birding in Central Park, and had asked a woman to not let her dog, harass these rare birds that were living in this bird sanctuary. And so there's, many examples of how policing in public space really influences, people's stress. And so I used Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality theory. Kimberly Crenshaw, if you're not familiar with her, was a Black legal scholar who did some research in the late 1980s, looking at the effect of race on income in an industrial kind of warehouse. And what she found was that actually, you know, gender amplified the disparity that was already there from race. And so that led her to develop intersectionality theory, where she posits that based on your identity, where you experience marginalization, whether you're a woman or a trans person or a Black person or an Indigenous person, how having those labels really contribute to your experience of oppression and marginalization. And so building on intersectionality theory, I read also, and not really building on, really combining it, W.E.B. Du Bois was a Black sociologist, and in 1897 wrote this piece for The Atlantic magazine on what he called double consciousness. And imagine being a Black sociologist with a PhD, you know, just at the turn of the 1900s. And so he wrote about what it was like to be a Black person in American society. And he referred to it as double consciousness or two-ness. And essentially, he spoke to having to keep in the back of your mind the fact that you are a Black person in a racist society. And so your experience of just life doesn't only involve the typical stresses that the average person does, or the non-marginalized or oppressed person does, but there's an added layer. So considering someone's intersectional identity with this concept of two-ness and this cognitive burden of double consciousness, I read some work by someone named Dr. Rodney Clark, who did research on racism-related vigilance. And he found that Black and Hispanic people in the United States actually have higher arterial elasticity and all sorts of other kind of issues that are associated with the vigilance that is attached to experiencing or anticipating racism in cities. So using that kind of foundation with my background, using wearable technology and understanding how people experience cities, I proposed that we, as a community and as a collective, you know, try to find ways to measure these disparities using neuroscience, so that we can finally actually acknowledge these experiences that are often dismissed and gaslighted by some people in our society. So that's a bit of a summary of, you know, where I'm from, what I've been doing, you know, my educational and my academic background. But Lisa asked me to talk about, you know, how do you push boundaries in healthcare and social policy? And I mean, in my experience, sometimes I push boundaries and I don't really know I'm doing them. And so I catch myself in these places where, you know, there's a mix of people from very different backgrounds having conversations about cities. And if I was to make some suggestions for the students watching this, you know, it's how do you place yourself in positions where you can bring the occupational lens that you've learned a lot about in your master's to problems that, you know, that you may not see OT as part of. But, you know, I've heard all sorts of, you know, taglines for OT, you know, the skills for everyday life, everyday living. I think Lisa mentioned something the other day about this idea of everyday living, what you do, who you love, what you love, and where you live. I think something like that. But you can correct me after, Lisa. But if you consider that, then occupational therapy and occupational science really encapsulates all of human life. And we probably have an opinion about everything from you know, using task analysis for how someone can you know, board a bus properly, to what kinds of questions municipal leaders like mayors or policymakers need to ask to ensure that, you know, people can engage in their meaningful occupations within the context of the city. So my route was really just, you know, saying yes to, you know, people asking me to volunteer for boards, or starting to volunteer and then getting your name out there and letting people know really about what you do and what you're interested in. And then I think a lot of really interesting connections can come up, and that's where I think the boundaries can be pushed. I think when you consider a boundary of a discipline, and role blurring and line blurring between you know, something like OT and social work, you have to understand the constraints of what your profession is, and I think frames of reference and models can help guide practice and remind you what it is that you're doing as an occupational therapist. But equally important, I think, is how you bridge those gaps and then push for new roles. I know that at U of T, there was like an emerging OT role placement where they would put an OT student in something. I don't know. At that time, I think addictions was something that OTs were just getting into, and I can't remember her last name, but Anushka at CAMH was like the first OT who worked in addictions, and since then now there's many OTs that work in addictions. So it's trying to figure out ways to kind of enter spaces that don't have people who think or look like you, and then trying to find ways to facilitate collaborations, and then you might have yourself a job in an area that never had an OT. But as someone who left clinical practice, I think if you're interested in academia, I chose cognitive neuroscience, and what's interesting is over the course of my PhD and all the classes I had to take, I always saw the OT lens. I took a class on mind wandering and inattention and flow. We read about Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who I know a lot of OTs love. We talked about him at U of T. And so when you place yourself in these different areas and you still have that OT lens, that's how you can build these bridges and do research projects that combine fields that have, never really involved OTs. See my time's like, it's 12:40. So I think that, it's as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, it's a really challenging time for us as a country. We have to really consider, I think our first priority should be reconciliation at every level. I think that when it comes to pushing boundaries or innovating, I'm less interested in some cool, some interesting technological innovation than I am in how we can start to move forward as a country and ensure that Indigenous peoples have what they need to live healthy lives, and that we see more Indigenous peoples as OTs. And so, I think that we need to find ways to expand what occupational therapy is about, maybe challenge some of what, the history we have on optimization and independence, recognize different worldviews on what health looks like. The Western medical model is very helpful, but it's also limited in how it conceptualizes well-being and also the role that the family and the collective plays. We live in a melting pot country. We live in a country with people with many different backgrounds. And so I think that the healthcare system and the social policy of the future really has to appreciate those differences of experiences, which is what I look at with experiential equity, and then make space, for different types of OTs, for different types of researchers, and for the experiences of your clients who might have had lives that you have not, that they might have lived lives that you don't understand. And so cultural competency and, really pulling from critical race theory and people like Kimberly Crenshaw, I think, can set us up to move forward in a way that ensures that occupational therapists and occupational scientists and educators and, the OTs of the future who are watching this, that we can really, meet the needs of this evolving, rapidly changing population and an aging population. So I've just said a lot there. It's 12:43, Lisa. How does 17 minutes sound for questions? And I can talk more.
That sounds really great, Robin. I feel like I've been taken back to the kind of old school academic lecture, and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, really? Great. I was trying to do something new.
It has been a while since I've not seen a PowerPoint presentation, and I loved it. So I hope everyone else did too, but we'll just open it up for questions if anyone has any questions for Robin and his very varied history of what got him here. And I think why I love what you talked about is just what the opportunities are for our students who are going out as new OTs after their last field work this summer. Just going out there and and not accepting just what there is, but really pushing for what there could be. So anyone have any questions for Robin?
Lisa, I have some comments, but I can wait for students to ask questions too.
Oh, go ahead, Sophia. We have plenty of time. And I know when Robin and I met last week, we both said we could end up talking for hours. So we kind of had to like cut off our time. So go ahead, Sophia. And if anyone else has questions asked, if you just put your name in the chat, then we can make sure that we know how many people have questions.
Yeah, I just want to say, Robin, thank you for the presentation. It really made me think a lot. I'm an OT in a psychiatric hospital here in Winnipeg, and I work on the inpatient units. So I was just kind of reflecting as you were talking about urban spaces, how all of my Indigenous clients have well, no, not all of them. Some of them live in the city, but a lot of clients I have that are flown in from up north, and how jarring that is to kind of like suddenly be in this urban center from having lived on a reserve or a landscape that was completely different, and how here in the hospital, like Indigenous women giving birth are flown in from their communities, and like that life event is happening in a different, like in an urban center that they're not used to, and kind of, it just got me reflecting on how that would impact their mental health as well, kind of that displacement that happens all the time. And I liked what you said about pushing boundaries. I've been reflecting since this residential school news came out, and always, I'm reflecting a lot on my work with Indigenous people, and I've met even some survivors this week who aren't doing well. And so I like what you said about like just trying to understand people whose lived experience is different than yours, because I'm asked to assess their function, and their life has been completely different than mine. So it's just kind of sitting back and listening to them, and also just reflecting on how we can push boundaries in jobs that are already OT heavy, like how I can even just push boundaries in the hospital that has lots of OTs and lots of OT jobs without I don't have to create a new OT role, but I can certainly push boundaries and try and change things right here at home. So those are just some of my reflections.
Wow. Lisa, can I respond to the reflections? Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. So I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I mean, you don't do easy work, so thank you. And it was interesting when I was living in Edmonton. Edmonton at the time, I mean, I moved there in 2012. Yeah, 2012. And when I was working on the Coast team, on the community outreach team, I was actually working quite closely with Alberta Hospital Edmonton. And at that time, the city was, I think, actually approaching Winnipeg for having, the highest number of urban Indigenous residents or something. Like it was a big thing. People were talking about it. So they had an Indigenous newcomer center. And I thought that was very interesting because I never even thought about that as being an issue. As you said, like it's hard to know other people's experiences. And so, so after that, I started paying attention on the poverty task force. We had an Indigenous roundtable. So it was really something that was a big part of my life. And, I was also teaching part-time at MacEwan as a sessional instructor in the occupational therapy assistant program. And they had just introduced Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese that year as the book of the year at MacEwan, which if people haven't read it, I highly encourage you, particularly this time. And we had the TRC hearings in 2014. So, and I attended them, and I was very lucky to have the support of an elder who was also an employee at Alberta Hospital Edmonton named Emil Durocher. And he invited me out to go on some sweats with him and the clients that he served at Alberta Hospital Edmonton, some of whom were inpatient clients and some of whom were outpatient clients. And that just changed how I saw everything. And the notion of the medicine wheel, the concept of the circle, this concept of connection to the land, these are all things that environmental psychologists, have turned into theories, but Indigenous people have known quite intuitively for millennia. And so, I think that I'm still learning more. One of the conversations I think that are really important when it comes to these, when I talk about racism, or when I talk about, where my family's from, my dad's from Bangladesh and he survived a genocide, no one really knows about that. And it's not people's fault. However, as educators and people who work in healthcare, who are also educators, psychoeducation, or whatever you want to call it, is a really big part of being an OT. So I would, it's a massive issue, but as healthcare professionals, I think just continue to learn if there are other things like the TRC hearings, if there are ways to connect with Indigenous elders who work with the hospitals. It's such an amazing resource, and it's a lifelong process. So I'm rambling a bit, but you gave me a lot to think about, and I appreciate your comments.
We also have a question in the chat, so I can read that out, by Olson Jarvis. So I like the perspective you brought from W.E.B. Du Bois. As a person of African descent and considering the response of people to the urban environment, what are your thoughts of removing statues of people who have been negatively associated with the past?
Thank you for the question. I think we just need to take them down and move on. I think that, a lot of the arguments are, well, you have to remember your history, and these statues are, this is a very political conversation. I'm really kind of bearing, my stance on these issues, but, doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. And in our modern society, people say people are always complaining about everything, and you're harmed by everything, and they call people snowflakes, but these are legacies of genocide and oppression, and I think that we should remove them. I saw that in Edmonton, Mayor Iveson, I think, put forward a motion to remove a mural of Grandin Station and replace that with Indigenous art, and I think a giant orange. Just a big giant orange board in commemoration of the children. So, people are doing it across cities. I think that we can be creative in how we can repurpose these spaces. And if the people who think that statues are the only way that you learn about history, we can learn about what happened in the past without having, relics of violence in the midst of our experiences of daily life in the city. I can't hear you for talking.
No, it's giving me a lot to think about as well. But just opening it up to, can I comment? Of course, Olson.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. And I guess you're hearing me? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do agree there's lots of ways to learn history. I guess my wife and I have had this conversation quite a bit. We're both of African descent. And I guess the one part we're kind of struggling with is when we take these statues away, how do we prevent people from bringing
You just lost your sound lost about 5 seconds ago. So how do we prevent?
How do we prevent people from coming back in the future and saying, "Hey, this guy was great"? And it's not like these people did all bad things, but there was just like their legacy was a lot of times bad. And how do we make sure that when people want to bring these things back, we say, hey, no, we took this down because. And I guess the concern is once these things are gone, how do we make sure that the education and the legacy of why we took them down goes away? I completely support getting rid of Bishop Grandin Boulevard because it is kind of like you can't get around Southern Winnipeg without it. But certain statues, how do we make sure that, hey, you know what, if someone starts a movement to bring this back, we got to remember, no, we took this down because.
Robin, you're just muted.
Sorry, there's like my 9 million Zoom and I still mute myself. Olson, thanks for that question. I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on this. I think that, context is extremely important. A lot of people from these, these eras did some really terrible things, and some politicians have said that we have to consider that context and that everyone was kind of evil at that time or whatever. But so I think we have to really understand where these kind of thoughts came from. At the same time, I do think we have to remove these reminders of these histories. But in terms of how you go about addressing the education, I have an example from Tulsa. A few weeks ago, I was invited to give a keynote for an urban planning conference that was really intended to commemorate the Tulsa Race Massacre, which if people aren't familiar with, I would encourage you to look it up. It's not an easy thing to learn about, but essentially in 1921, a community of freed slaves who actually built a really wonderful urban center in Tulsa, in Greenwood, had it burnt down essentially by the KKK and the police, and many, many people were murdered. And it's a part of America's history that people don't know much about in America, let alone in Canada. But since then, they have really moved. They're trying to move forward as a community and engage in reconciliation. And there's a museum and an art space being built to commemorate it. But that's a multi-million-dollar project. But they also have street art. They have a piece of art that says Black Wall Street. And there was actually a teacher I was reading about this mural in the Tulsa, Oklahoma newspaper to understand, really the scene there, because I can physically go there because of the pandemic. But this teacher said that, when I'm walking around, I took my students on a field trip and we went to this mural, and you can use art to tell a story. That's, you can bring beauty to public space and tell a story about what happened somewhere. And so I think when we take these, hopefully when we take these statues down, we can put art in its place that compensate for the perhaps centuries of the absence of the narrative that really is what's embedded in that landscape. There's a trend in Canada. When I gave a talk in Saskatoon a few years ago for their design festival, and I met someone who was engaged with Indigenous placemaking. What does Indigenous placemaking look like? Placemaking is a term in urban design practice that involves, using art or some kind of, structural intervention to create a sense of place. And so I think the storytelling will always be necessary, I think orally, but I think there are ways for us to leave, memorials to lives lost and lives affected by these legacies. And I think we can make it beautiful.
And just connecting with your research, probably less of a stress response than what we currently have accessing these spaces. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple comments that I'll use to wrap up. Lois has put, with the pandemic and socially isolating in homes, many are needing green space and moving to homes that have yards instead of having apartments with or without the balcony. But real estate sale of homes has gone to the seller's market then. So we have these other economic consequences, which really, I think, brings us back to the beginning, Lois, about why I was so drawn to Robin's work and have been following his work, even though mine seems in finance and health seems so diverse from Robin's work, but I think it really sets this foundation. Dr. Phil has put in there that she hosts an urbanism book club 4 times a year, and she provided her email address there if anyone in the audience is interested. And we had a typo. And Patty also said, thank you for an excellent talk showing the strength of transdisciplinary approaches and taking risks, bringing our strengths and learning within with communities in different spaces. And Olsen responded, using art as a form of depicting the story, like it, me as well. And Maya said, thank you. As a soon-to-be OT, it was so cool to hear how you brought the OT lens to different areas of study like design and human geography or geo, and gives me lots to think about. And Maya, thank you, because that was my hope, is inviting Robin here, because I've been listening and watching his own career develop through social media. Sounds kind of creepy, but it's how we do things nowadays. So it's 1:00. This Masters of Research or Masters of OT Research Symposium will start again with presentations on different links from this one at 1:15. And otherwise, Robin, I'd love to thank you for this presentation. It really did take me back to kind of what my old school idea of academia was, of listening to someone's story and knowledge. And we're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. And I'm looking forward to keeping in contact. And I think the best way to contact you is through Twitter. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I mean, send me an email, I think is probably best.
Oh, yeah. But if the students or anything are wanting to follow you, or you also have a webpage as well. Yeah,
robinmazumder.com. It has all my contact info on there and a contact form. So you can just send me an email. But yeah, follow me on Twitter and tag me in things that you think I might find interesting. If you ever have any questions, please let me know. I remember the feeling of approaching the end of my OT degree. It's an extremely exciting time. I'm really proud of everyone here. Finishing an OT degree during a pandemic is not easy. Doing anything during a pandemic is not easy, but that's a particularly impressive feat. So thanks again, Lisa. Thank you to the College of Rehab Sciences and everyone who attended today, and get in touch if I can help.
Perfect. Thank you, and all the best as you finish up your stay in Mexico and come back to Canada at some point.
Very soon. I think by the end of the month. Just been
okay.
Okay.
It's now warm up here, so you can come back.
Amazing. Perfect. Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
Have a really great day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Lisa.
Bye.